So when we met, Chuck was a senior in high school. He had just turned 18. That winter, a kid in the schoolyard called Chuck's mom a crack whore. Chuck pushed the kid's face into the snow, and the school cops charged him with aggravated assault. The other kid was fine the next day. I think it was his pride that was injured more than anything. But anyway, since Chuck was 18, this ag assault case sent him to adult county jail on State Road in Northeast Philadelphia, where he sat, unable to pay the bail. He couldn't afford it, while the trial dates dragged on and on and on through almost his entire senior year. Finally, near the end of this season, the judge on this assault case threw out most of the charges, and Chuck came home with only a few $100s worth of court fees hanging over his head. Tim was pretty happy that day. The next fall, Chuck tried to re-enroll as a senior, but the school secretary told him that he was then 19 and too old to be readmitted. Then the judge on his assault case issued him a warrant for his arrest because he couldn't pay the $225 in court fees that came due a few weeks after the case ended. Then he was a high school dropout living on the run. Tim's first arrest came later that year after he turned 11. Chuck had managed to get his warrant lifted, and he was on a payment plan for the court fees, and he was driving Tim to school in his girlfriend's car. So a cop pulls him over, runs the car, and the car comes up as stolen in California. Chuck had no idea where in the history of this car it had been stolen. His girlfriend's uncle bought it from a used car auction in Northeast Philly. Chuck and Tim had never been outside of the tri-state, let alone to California. But anyway, the cops down at the precinct charged Chuck with receiving stolen property. And then a juvenile judge, a few days later, charged Tim, age 11, with accessory to receiving stolen property. And then he was placed on 3 years of probation. With this probation sentence hanging over his head, Chuck sat his little brother down and began teaching him how to run from the police. They would sit side by side on their back porch looking out onto the shared alleyway, and Chuck would coach Tim how to spot undercover cars, how to negotiate a late-night police raid, how and where to hide. I want you to imagine for a second what Chuck and Tim's lives would be like if they were living in a neighborhood where kids were going to college, not prison. A neighborhood like the one I got to grow up in. Okay, you might say, but Chuck and Tim, kids like them, they're committing crimes. Don't they deserve to be in prison? Don't they deserve to be living in fear of arrest? Well, my answer would be no, they don't. And certainly not for the same things that other young people with more privilege are doing with impunity. If Chuck had gone to my high school, that schoolyard fight would have ended there as a schoolyard fight. It never would have become an aggravated assault case. Not a single kid that I went to college with has a criminal record right now. Not a single one. But can you imagine how many might have if the police had stopped those kids and searched their pockets for drugs as they walked to class, or had raided their frat parties in the middle of the night? Okay, you might say, but doesn't this high incarceration rate partly account for our really low crime rate? Crime is down, that's a good thing. Yeah, totally, that is a good thing. Crime is down. It dropped precipitously in the 90s and through the 2000s. But according to a committee of academics convened by the National Academy of Sciences last year, the relationship between our historically high incarceration rates and our low crime rate is pretty shaky. It turns out that the crime rate goes up and down irrespective of how many young people we send to prison. We tend to think about justice in a pretty narrow way, good and bad, innocent and guilty. Injustice is about being wrongfully convicted. So if you're convicted of something you did do, you should be punished for it. There are innocent and guilty people, there are victims and there are perpetrators. Maybe we could think a little bit more broadly than that. Right now, we're asking kids who live in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, who have the least amount of family resources, who are attending the country's worst schools, who are facing the toughest time in the labor market, who are living in neighborhoods where violence is an everyday problem. We're asking these kids to walk the thinnest possible line, to basically never do anything wrong? Why are we not providing support to young kids facing these challenges? Why are we offering only handcuffs, jail time, and this fugitive existence? Can we imagine something better? Can we imagine a criminal justice system that prioritizes recovery, prevention, civic inclusion, rather than punishment? A criminal justice system that acknowledges the legacy of exclusion that poor people of color in the US have faced and that does not promote and perpetuate those exclusions. And finally, a criminal justice system that believes in Black young people, rather than treating Black young people as the enemy to be rounded up.